The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves through the cobblestone streets of Millfield County, Pennsylvania. October 1891 had brought with it an early frost that painted the rolling hills in shades of amber and gold. But inside the courthouse square, the air felt thick with something far colder than weather. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Benjamin Crawford stood at the edge of a gathering crowd, his weathered hands gripping the brim of his black felt hat. At 42, he carried the weight of recent loss in the deep lines around his eyes and the slight stoop to his shoulders. The gold wedding band on his finger caught the pale sunlight. He hadn't been able to bring himself to remove it, even though Sarah had been gone for 8 months now. The auction block had been erected in the center of the square, a makeshift wooden platform that seemed to tower over the assembled townspeople like a monument to human cruelty. Thomas had come to town for supplies, nothing more. His small farm on the outskirts of Millfield barely provided enough to sustain himself these days, but he managed to scrape together enough coin for flour, coffee, and the basic necessities that kept him moving through each empty day. He should have walked away, should have completed his business at Henderson's General Store and ridden his wagon back to the lonely farmhouse where Sarah's quilts still lay folded in the cedar chest and her favorite teacup remained unwashed on the kitchen shelf. But something made him stay, some morbid curiosity about what could possibly warrant such a spectacle on this crisp Thursday morning. The auctioneer, a portly man named Jeremiah Blackwood, with a voice that could carry across 3 counties, climbed onto the platform with theatrical flourish. His red vest strained against his considerable belly, and his mutton-chop whiskers bristled as he surveyed the crowd with obvious satisfaction. "Ladies and gentlemen of Millfield County," Blackwood bellowed, his voice echoing off the brick facades of the surrounding buildings, "today we have a most unusual lot to present for your consideration. A complete domestic unit, as it were, available for immediate service to any upstanding citizen with the means to provide proper supervision." Thomas felt his stomach turn even before he understood exactly what was happening. Around him, the crowd pressed closer with the hungry anticipation of spectators at a gladiator fight. Women in their finest bonnets whispered behind gloved hands while men in wool coats and leather boots shuffled forward for a better view. Then they appeared. 6 figures emerged from a covered wagon at the side of the square, herded forward by 2 deputies with rifles across their arms. A woman who couldn't have been more than 28 walked at the front, her spine straight despite the obvious exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She wore a simple brown dress that had seen better days, but she carried herself with a dignity that no amount of hardship could diminish. Behind her came 5 children, arranged by height like stair steps. The oldest, a boy who might have reached 13, kept his arm protectively around a girl of perhaps 10. Behind them, 3 smaller children clung to each other, twin boys who looked to be around 7, and a little girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old, her thumb planted firmly in her mouth as she stared wide-eyed at the gathered crowd. Thomas felt something crack inside his chest. In the woman's protective stance over her children, he saw an echo of Sarah during their own struggles. In the oldest boy's fierce protectiveness of his siblings, he remembered his own childhood, caring for his younger brother after their parents died of consumption. And in the terrified faces of the smallest children, he saw innocence being auctioned away like livestock. "Lot number 17, Blackwood announced with grotesque cheerfulness. The Morrison family recently came under county supervision following unfortunate circumstances. The woman, Rebecca, is said to be skilled in all manner of domestic arts, cooking, cleaning, mending, and childcare. The children range in age from 4 to 13, all in good health and capable of light labor appropriate to their years. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some voices carried excitement, others disgust, but most held the detached calculation of people evaluating the value of human merchandise. Thomas wanted to cover his ears, to block out the casual cruelty of it all, but he found himself frozen. In place, Blackwood continued his nauseating presentation. Due to the death of the family patriarch and subsequent financial difficulties, the county has determined that the most humane course of action is to secure proper employment and housing for this family unit. Bidding will begin at $5, and the winning bidder will assume full responsibility for housing, feeding, and supervising all 6 individuals for a period of no less than 2 years. Thomas learned fragments of their story from the whispered conversations around him. Rebecca Morrison's husband had been killed in a mining accident 6 weeks earlier. With no family nearby and mounting debts from his medical treatment, she had been unable to pay rent on their small house in the mining settlement of Copper Hollow, 20 miles north of Millfield. When she couldn't find work that would allow her to care for her children, no respectable establishment would hire a woman with 5 young ones in tow. The county had stepped in with its own solution. The system was perfectly legal under Pennsylvania's labor laws of the time. Families who couldn't support themselves could be bound out to those who could provide for them, with the county handling the arrangements and collecting a small administrative fee. It was, officials claimed, a charitable act that prevented families from being separated and sent to different poorhouses. In practice, it was legalized slavery with a more palatable name. "Do I hear $5?" Blackwood called out, his gavel raised in anticipation. A farmer from the eastern part of the county raised his hand. Thomas recognized him as Silas Hartwell, a man known for working his hired hands from dawn to dusk and paying them barely enough to survive. Hartwell's small eyes gleamed as he looked over the Morrison family like he was evaluating the potential yield of a crop. $5. Hartwell called out. "They look strong enough for field work." Rebecca Morrison's face remained carefully composed, but Thomas saw her hand tighten protectively on her youngest daughter's shoulder. The little girl had begun to cry silently, tears streaming down her cheeks as she pressed closer to her mother's side. $7, came another voice. This one belonged to Horace Pemberton, who owned the largest boarding house in town. Pemberton had a reputation for overworking his staff and keeping them in conditions that barely met legal requirements. "The woman and older children could manage my kitchen and cleaning duties." Thomas found his hands clenching into fists. Around him, the bidding continued with the casual brutality of men haggling over the price of cattle. Rebecca Morrison stood on that platform, with her children pressed close to her sides, watching her family's fate being decided by strangers who saw them as nothing more than potential labor. $10, Hartwell countered, his voice carrying an edge of possessiveness that made Thomas's skin crawl. The auctioneer's eyes lit up with greedy satisfaction. $10 from Mr. Hartwell. Do I hear 12? That's when Thomas noticed her eyes. Rebecca Morrison was looking directly at him, and in her gaze he saw something that hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't pleading or desperation, though. Surely she felt both. It wasn't fear, though that was there too in the slight tremor of her hands. What he saw was recognition. The look of one drowning person reaching out to another. She had seen something in his face, some flicker of genuine human sympathy in a crowd full of calculating stares and cruel amusement. Her look didn't beg for salvation. It simply acknowledged that he was perhaps the only person in that square who saw her and her children as human beings rather than commodities. $12. Pemberton called out, his voice cutting through Thomas's moment of connection. With the woman on the platform, the bidding war intensified. Hartwell countered with 15. Pemberton responded with 18. A third voice joined the fray, Marcus Webb, who owned a textile mill and was known for his harsh treatment of workers, including children young enough that they should have been in school rather than working 16-hour shifts. $22, Webb announced. The older children would be useful in my mill operations. Thomas felt sick. He thought of Sarah, who had spent her last months planning the family they would never have. She had knitted tiny booties and sewn small clothes, filling a hope chest with dreams that would never be realized. After her death, he had stored everything away, unable to bear the sight of those symbols of a future that consumption had stolen from them. But now, watching these children face a future of exploitation and hardship, he heard Sarah's voice as clearly as if she was standing beside him. She had always said that love wasn't something you hoarded. It was something you shared, especially with those who needed it most. $25, Hartwell shouted, his face flushed with the excitement of competition. Thomas looked at Rebecca Morrison again. She was no longer watching him. Her attention had turned to her children, whispering what he assumed were words of comfort to the youngest ones. The oldest boy, who had maintained his protective stance throughout the ordeal, was fighting back tears with the fierce determination of someone forced to grow up too quickly. The scene crystallized into a moment of perfect, terrible clarity. Thomas could walk away. He could finish his business in town, return to his empty farmhouse, and spend the rest of his days tending his small plot of land in solitude. He had enough saved to live modestly, and no one would blame a widower for keeping to himself, or he could step forward and change everything. $30, Thomas called out, his voice carrying clearly across the square, despite the way his heart hammered against his ribs. A hush fell over the crowd. $30 was more than many families in Millfield saw in 3 months. It was certainly more than anyone expected a simple farmer to bid on what most considered an act of charity rather than a sound investment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Blackwood's eyes widened with surprise and delight. $30 from Mr. Crawford. Do I hear 35? Hartwell scowled and opened his mouth to respond, but Thomas cut him off before he could speak. $50, Thomas announced, his voice steady despite the way his hands shook. And that's my final offer. The crowd erupted in murmurs of shock and speculation. $50 represented nearly everything Thomas had saved since Sarah's death. Money he had planned to use for repairs to his farmhouse and improvements to his small herd of cattle. It was reckless, impractical, and financially devastating. It was also the most right thing he had ever done. Blackwood looked around, the crowd expectantly, but the other bidders had fallen silent. $50 was far beyond what anyone was willing to spend on indentured labor, especially when that labor came with the complication of housing and feeding 6 people for 2 years. $50 going once, the auctioneer called out. Going twice. He paused dramatically, scanning the crowd for any last-minute bids. Sold to Thomas Crawford for $50. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder. Thomas felt as though he was moving through a dream as he made his way to the front of the crowd. The county clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers named Albert Morse, had already prepared the necessary paperwork. The contract was straightforward but binding. Thomas would assume full legal responsibility for the Morrison family for a minimum of 2 years. In exchange, they would provide labor appropriate to their abilities, and he would provide adequate housing, food, and supervision. As Thomas counted out the bills and coins that represented most of his worldly wealth, he caught sight of Rebecca, Morrison's face. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, surprise certainly, and perhaps a cautious hope, but also something that might have been wariness. After all, she had no way of knowing whether she and her children were being rescued or simply transferred to a different form of captivity. "Mr. Crawford," Clerk Morse said, as he handed over the signed contract, "you understand that you are now legally responsible for the conduct and welfare of all 6 individuals. Any attempt to abandon this responsibility before the contract period expires will result in significant legal penalties." Thomas nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead to the practical implications of what he had just done. His small farmhouse had 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that could barely accommodate 1 person, let alone 7. His root cellar contained enough preserved food for himself through the winter, but feeding 6 additional people, including growing children, would require careful planning and likely additional purchases he couldn't afford. But those were problems to be solved later. Right now, he needed to get the Morrison family away from the cruel stares and whispered speculation of the crowd. "Mrs. Morrison," he said quietly, addressing Rebecca directly for the first time, "if you and your children would follow me, I have a wagon just around the corner." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to discern his intentions from his expression. Finally, she nodded and gathered her children around her. "Children," she said softly, "we're going with Mr. Crawford now." The oldest boy, Daniel, Thomas learned later, stepped forward slightly. Despite his youth, there was something protective and almost aggressive in his posture. "What do you want with us, mister?" he asked, his voice carrying a challenge that spoke well of his character. Thomas knelt down so he could meet the boy's eyes on his level. "I want to give you and your family a place to live where you'll be treated with dignity and respect," he said simply. "I know you have no reason to trust me, but I hope that in time you'll see that I mean what I say." Daniel stared at him for another moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "But if you hurt my mama or my brothers and sisters, I'll make you sorry." Despite everything, Thomas felt a small smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "I would expect nothing less," he replied. "A man who won't protect his family isn't much of a man at all." As they made their way through the crowd toward Thomas's wagon, he heard the whispered comments and speculation that followed in their wake. Some voices carried disapproval. What was a respectable widower doing with a woman and her children? Others expressed curiosity about his motives. A few carried darker suggestions about what a man might want with a young woman and her family. Thomas ignored them all. He had spent 8 months listening to well-meaning neighbors and church members tell him how he should grieve, how he should live, how he should plan for his future. Today, for the first time since Sarah's death, he was acting purely on his own moral compass, rather than trying to meet others' expectations. The wagon was exactly where he had left it, hitched to his 2 draft horses, Chester and Belle. The animals were getting old but still reliable, and Thomas had equipped the wagon with a canvas cover that would provide some protection from the October wind during the ride back to his farm. Rebecca Morrison helped her smaller children into the wagon bed, while Daniel and the 10-year-old girl, whose name Thomas learned was Margaret, climbed up on their own. Thomas noticed that Rebecca moved with careful economy, as if every gesture had been planned to conserve energy. It was the movement of someone who had been hungry for too long, who had learned to function on too little sleep and too much worry. "Mrs. Morrison," Thomas said as he prepared to help her onto the wagon seat beside him, "I want you to know that you and your children are not my servants. You're my guests until we can figure out a more permanent arrangement that works for everyone." She paused with one foot on the wagon step, looking at him with surprise. "Mr. Crawford, the contract is a legal necessity," Thomas interrupted gently. "It doesn't define how we treat each other as human beings." For the first time since he had seen her on the auction platform, Rebecca Morrison's carefully controlled expression cracked slightly. Her eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away, but not before Thomas saw the profound relief and gratitude in them. "Thank you," she whispered, so quietly that only he could hear. As Thomas guided the wagon out of Millfield's town square and onto the dirt road that led to his farm, He felt the weight of 6 new lives settling onto his shoulders. He had no clear plan for how to feed, house, and care for 7 people on a property barely adequate for one. He had no experience with children, no understanding of what Rebecca and her family might need to heal from their recent trauma. What he had was a bone-deep certainty that he had done the right thing, and a determination to figure out everything else as he went along. The autumn sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills, painting the countryside in shades of gold and crimson. Behind him in the wagon bed, he could hear the soft murmur of Rebecca's voice as she comforted her children, and the occasional question from one of the older ones about where they were going. The road ahead stretched through rolling farmland, dotted with oak and maple trees in their full autumn glory. Thomas had traveled this route countless times over the years, but today it felt different, like a path towards something entirely new, rather than simply the way home to an empty house and a solitary life. In the distance, smoke rose from the chimneys of scattered farmhouses where families were beginning their evening routines. Soon, Thomas would be part of that domestic rhythm again, though in a way he had never imagined when he woke that morning. The thought was both terrifying and oddly comforting. As the wagon wheels rolled steadily over the packed earth road, Thomas found himself thinking about Sarah and what she would have made of his impulsive decision. She had always been the practical one, the planner who thought through consequences and weighed options carefully. But she had also been the one with the bigger heart, the one who brought home stray cats and worried about elderly neighbors during harsh winters. He thought she would have understood. More than that, he thought she would have been proud. The Crawford farmstead appeared through the golden afternoon light, like something from a half-remembered dream. Thomas felt his chest tighten as they crested the small hill that overlooked his property, not from pride, but from sudden awareness of how inadequate his humble home would seem to a family accustomed to loss, but still deserving of so much more. The house sat in a shallow valley surrounded by gently rolling fields, a modest 2-story structure built from local fieldstone and weathered cedar shingles. Sarah had painted the shutters blue during their 2nd year of marriage, and though the color had faded considerably, traces of that optimistic brightness still caught the late afternoon sun. A wide front porch wrapped around 2 sides of the building, its wooden steps worn smooth by years of use. Behind the house, a red barn housed Thomas's small collection of livestock: 3 milk cows, a handful of chickens, 2 pigs, and Chester and Bell's nighttime stalls. A vegetable garden, now mostly harvested except for the hardier root vegetables that could withstand light frost, stretched between the house and barn. Beyond that, fields of corn stubble and winter wheat marked the boundaries of Thomas's modest but productive holdings. It wasn't much by the standards of the wealthy landowners whose vast estates dotted the more fertile river valleys, but it represented honest work and careful stewardship. More importantly, it was home, or at least it had been before loneliness turned even the most familiar spaces into monuments to solitude. "Children," Rebecca Morrison called softly from the wagon seat beside Thomas. "Come look at where we'll be staying." Thomas heard rustling from the wagon bed as the 5 Morrison children shifted to peer over the wooden sides. The youngest, 4-year-old Emma, pointed with wonder at the chickens pecking in the farmyard. "Mama, look at all the birds." "Those are chickens, silly," corrected 10-year-old Margaret with the patient superiority of an older sister. "They lay eggs for breakfast." Daniel, the 13-year-old who had appointed himself family protector, studied the property with the calculating eye of someone forced to think practically about survival. Thomas could almost see him cataloguing resources: the size of the fields, the condition of the buildings, the evidence of livestock that might provide milk and meat. The 7-year-old twins, James and Joseph, had fallen asleep against each other. During the journey, their identical faces peaceful in a way that spoke of exhaustion beyond their years. Thomas made a mental note to ask Rebecca later about their sleeping arrangements. Clearly, these children had been through enough disruption without adding unnecessary discomfort to their burden. As the wagon rolled into the farmyard, Chester and Belle automatically headed for the barn, their evening routine so ingrained that they needed no guidance from Thomas. He set the brake and climbed down, then turned to help Rebecca from her seat. She accepted his assistance with quiet dignity, but he noticed how she immediately moved to assist her own children rather than waiting for him to help them. "Mr. Crawford," Rebecca said as her feet touched solid ground, "this is a beautiful place. We're grateful for your kindness in bringing us here." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Please, just call me Thomas, and there's no need for gratitude. This arrangement benefits me as much as it does your family." It was a polite lie, and they both knew it. Thomas had managed perfectly well on his own for 8 months, and taking on 6 additional people would strain his resources considerably. But something in Rebecca's expression suggested she appreciated the fiction that allowed her to accept help without feeling like a burden. Daniel had helped the twins down from the wagon and was now standing protectively close to his mother, his young face serious with responsibility. Margaret held Emma's hand while scanning the farmyard with curious eyes. Despite their recent trauma, Thomas was struck by how well-behaved and considerate the children seemed, a testament to their mother's character and their father's influence during his too brief life. "I imagine you're all tired and hungry," Thomas said, addressing the group but looking primarily at Rebecca. "Why don't we get you settled inside, and then I'll show you around properly." The front door opened into a modest parlor furnished with pieces Thomas and Sarah had collected during their 7 years of marriage. A brick fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by built-in bookshelves that held Sarah's collection of novels and Thomas's farming journals. 2 windows faced east toward the road, their glass panes cleaned weekly out of habit, even though Thomas rarely had visitors to impress. Rebecca stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene with the careful attention of someone evaluating both opportunities and potential threats. The children clustered around her, equally curious and cautious about this new environment that would apparently be their home for the foreseeable future. "The kitchen is through here," Thomas said, leading them through a doorway into the heart of the house. The kitchen was larger than the parlor, with a cast-iron cook stove that Sarah had insisted on having shipped from Philadelphia despite the considerable expense. A large wooden table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by chairs that Thomas had built himself during the long winter evenings of his first year of marriage. Windows on 2 walls provided good light for cooking and filled the space with the golden glow of late afternoon sun. A hand pump at the sink drew water from the well Thomas had dug when he first claimed the property, and shelves along the walls held dishes, cookware, and the preserved foods that would sustain them through the coming winter. Emma immediately gravitated toward a rag doll that sat on one of the kitchen chairs, a toy Sarah had sewn during her final illness, though she had never spoken of her hopes for the child who might have played with it. Thomas had left it there after Sarah's death, unable to pack it away with her other belongings, but somehow comforted by its continued presence. "May I?" Emma asked, looking up at Thomas with the solemn politeness of a child who had learned not to assume anything belonged to her. Thomas felt his throat constrict slightly. "Of course, I think that doll has been lonely without someone to play with." Rebecca's sharp intake of breath suggested she understood the significance of the gesture, though she said nothing. Instead, she moved to the stove and examined it with the professional interest of someone who would be responsible for preparing meals. "This is a beautiful stove," she said, "much nicer than anything we had in Copper Hollow." Thomas nodded, remembering Sarah's excitement when the delivery wagon had finally brought the stove from the railroad depot in Millfield. "My wife insisted on it. She said life was too short to fight with inferior equipment every time you wanted to cook a proper meal. It was the first time he had mentioned Sarah directly, and he watched Rebecca's face for her reaction. Her expression softened with understanding rather than awkwardness, and she nodded slightly as if acknowledging both his loss and the privilege of being welcomed into a space that still held such memories. "Now then," Thomas said, moving toward the narrow staircase that led to the second floor, "let me show you the sleeping arrangements. I'm afraid they're somewhat limited, but we'll make do." The upstairs consisted of 2 bedrooms and a small storage room under the eaves. Thomas's own room occupied the larger of the 2 spaces, with windows facing both east and south. The second bedroom had been intended as a nursery, though Sarah's illness had prevented them from ever using it for that purpose. "Mrs. Morrison, you and Emma can take this room," Thomas said, indicating the smaller space. "I've been using it mainly for storage, but it has a good bed and plenty of space for your things." Rebecca stepped into the room and examined it carefully. A double bed with a carved wooden headboard dominated the space, covered with one of Sarah's quilts in a pattern of interlocking rings. A dresser with an oval mirror stood against one wall, and a small rocking chair sat near the window. "And the boys?" she asked. Thomas had been thinking about this problem during the wagon ride. "The storage room under the eaves is larger than it looks. With some cleaning and a few modifications, it could house the boys comfortably. There's a window for light and air, and enough space for beds and their belongings." Daniel had followed them upstairs and now stood examining the proposed sleeping space with the same practical assessment he had applied to the farm itself. "This could work," he said after a moment. "James and Joseph can share a bed, and Margaret and I can manage with our own spaces." "Actually," Thomas said, "I was thinking Margaret might prefer to stay with her mother and Emma, at least initially. The storage room might be more suitable for just you and the twins." Margaret looked relieved at this suggestion, though she was too polite to say so directly. At 10 years old, she was old enough to feel awkward about sleeping in the same room as her older brother, especially in a stranger's house where the rules and expectations remained unclear. Rebecca seemed to understand the delicate social calculations involved. "That sounds like an excellent arrangement," she said. "Margaret and Emma will be good company for each other." Over the next hour, Thomas found himself caught up in the practical business of transforming his solitary household into a home for 7 people. He carried beds and mattresses from the barn, where he had stored furniture left over from his parents' estate. Rebecca proved remarkably capable at organizing space and making quick decisions about arrangements that would work for her family's specific needs. The children, meanwhile, began the tentative process of exploring their new environment. Daniel appointed himself responsible for settling the twins, who had awakened from their nap, cranky and disoriented. Margaret took charge of Emma, showing her around the house and explaining what they observed in the patient tone of someone accustomed to caring for younger siblings. By the time the sun began to set behind the western hills, the Crawford farmhouse had been transformed into something it had never been before, a genuinely busy family home. The sounds of children's voices echoed through rooms that had been silent for too long, and the kitchen filled with the purposeful activity of meal preparation. Rebecca had taken charge of supper without being asked, using ingredients from Thomas's pantry to create a simple but satisfying meal of cornbread, beans, and preserved vegetables. She worked with efficient grace, clearly comfortable in a kitchen despite the unfamiliarity of the space and equipment. "Can I help?" Thomas asked, feeling oddly displaced in his own home. Rebecca glanced up from the pot she was stirring. "Could you set the table? I'm not sure where you keep your dishes." It was such a normal domestic request that Thomas felt momentarily disoriented. For 8 months, he had eaten most of his meals standing at the kitchen counter, using the same plate and cup day after day. The idea of setting a proper table for 7 people seemed almost fantastically elaborate, but he found himself retrieving Sarah's good dishes from the china cabinet, plates and bowls they had received as wedding gifts but rarely used. If there was ever an occasion that called for good china, surely it was the first meal shared by this unlikely new household. As they gathered around the kitchen table, Thomas looked at the faces illuminated by lamplight and felt something shift inside his chest. Emma sat on a cushion that brought her closer to table height, seriously cutting her cornbread into precise small bites. The twins flanked their mother, their identical faces showing the relaxation that comes with food and security. Margaret helped serve the younger children with the competence of someone who had been shouldering adult responsibilities for too long. Daniel maintained his protective watchfulness, but Thomas noticed that some of the tension had left his shoulders, and Rebecca presided over it all with quiet authority, making sure everyone had enough to eat while keeping the conversation light and reassuring. "Mr. Crawford," she said during a lull in the children's chatter, "tomorrow I'd like to discuss how our family can best contribute to the work of this farm. We're not helpless, and we don't want to be a burden." Thomas set down his fork and looked at her seriously. "Mrs. Morrison, I want to be very clear about something. Yes, the legal contract specifies that you and your children will provide labor in exchange for housing and support, but I won't have you working yourselves to exhaustion or sacrificing the children's education for the sake of farm chores." Daniel looked up sharply at the mention of education. "Will we be able to go to school?" "The district school is about 2 miles down the road," Thomas replied. "It's a good school with a dedicated teacher. I see no reason why you and Margaret shouldn't attend regularly." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. "That's very generous." In Copper Hollow, the children missed considerable schooling while their father was ill, and after he died, they're both bright and eager to learn. The conversation continued in this vein throughout the meal, with Thomas learning more about the Morrison family's history and capabilities. Rebecca had taught school before her marriage and was clearly intelligent and well-educated. Daniel had helped his father with various manual labor jobs and was stronger and more capable than his 13 years might suggest. Margaret had been her mother's primary assistant in caring for the younger children and managing household tasks. Even the twins and Emma, young as they were, had been shaped by necessity into helpful, responsible children who understood the value of contributing to family welfare. As the evening progressed and the younger children began to show signs of fatigue, Rebecca organized the bedtime routines with the smooth efficiency of long practice. Thomas found himself relegated to the role of observer, watching this family knit itself back together in the space of a few hours. But it wasn't until later, after the children had been settled in their beds and Rebecca had insisted on washing the supper dishes, that the real conversation began. They sat in the parlor with cups of coffee, the lamplight creating a circle of warmth against the growing darkness outside. Thomas had lit a fire in the fireplace, more for comfort than warmth, and the flames cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Mr. Crawford," Rebecca began, then paused and corrected herself. "Thomas, I need you to understand something about my family's situation." Thomas waited, sensing that whatever she was about to say required careful attention. "We're not charity cases," she continued, her voice firm despite its quiet tone. "My husband was a good man who worked hard to provide for his family. His death was a terrible accident, and our subsequent difficulties were largely due to circumstances beyond our control. But we're not weak people, and we're not looking for someone to take care of us indefinitely." Thomas nodded slowly. "I didn't think you were. What I'm trying to say is that we need this arrangement to work for everyone involved. I won't have my children growing up feeling like servants or dependents. They need to maintain their dignity and their sense of their own worth. The words carried weight that went beyond their surface meaning. Thomas realized that Rebecca was negotiating the terms of their coexistence, establishing boundaries that would allow her family to accept help, without losing their self-respect. "I understand," he said, "and I agree completely. Whatever arrangement we work out needs to feel fair and respectful to everyone involved." Rebecca studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his words matched his intentions. Finally, she seemed to reach a conclusion that satisfied her. "In that case," she said, "I think we can make this work very well indeed." Outside, the October wind rustled through the dying leaves of the oak trees that surrounded the farmhouse. Inside, two adults who had been strangers that morning began the delicate process of building trust and defining the boundaries of an unconventional household. Thomas looked at this woman who had appeared in his life so unexpectedly and felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, a sense of purpose that extended beyond simple survival. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and complications, but tonight the farmhouse felt alive again with the sounds and energy of family life. For the first time in 8 months, Thomas Crawford didn't dread the coming of dawn. The first week at the Crawford farm passed with deceptive tranquility. Thomas found himself rising each morning to the unfamiliar sounds of a busy household, children's voices calling to each other, Rebecca's quiet humming as she prepared breakfast, and the general bustle of a family beginning their day. After 8 months of waking to silence broken only by roosters and the occasional lowing of cattle, the change felt both jarring and profoundly comforting. Rebecca had proven herself an exceptional organizer and manager. Within 3 days, she had established routines that kept the household running smoothly, while ensuring that everyone, including Thomas, had clearly defined roles and responsibilities. The children responded to her gentle but firm guidance with the kind of immediate cooperation that spoke of deep trust and established patterns of family cooperation. Daniel had appointed himself Thomas's shadow during morning chores, following him to the barn and asking intelligent questions about livestock care, crop rotation, and farm management. The boy possessed an intuitive understanding of agricultural work that impressed Thomas considerably. Despite his youth, Daniel approached each task with the focused attention of someone who understood that knowledge meant survival. "How do you know when a cow's getting sick before she shows obvious symptoms?" Daniel asked on Thursday morning. As they milked the 3 cows together, Thomas paused in his steady rhythm to consider the question. "You watch for small changes in behavior. Daisy here usually pushes to the front when I bring grain, but yesterday she hung back a little. Her milk production dropped by about a cup, and she's been standing with her weight shifted slightly to favor her left rear leg." Daniel absorbed this information with the serious attention of a student taking notes. "So you have to know each animal individually?" "Exactly. Every cow, every pig, every chicken has its own personality and habits. When you know what's normal for each animal, you can spot problems early." This conversation represented a pattern that had developed throughout the week. Daniel's questions went far beyond simple curiosity. He was systematically learning everything he could about farming, as if preparing himself to take over operations at a moment's notice. Thomas found the boy's intensity both admirable and slightly heartbreaking, recognizing the premature burden of responsibility that circumstances had placed on such young shoulders. Margaret, meanwhile, had become Rebecca's primary assistant in managing the household. At 10 years old, she possessed skills that many adult women might envy. She could bake bread that rivaled Rebecca's, mend clothing with neat, nearly invisible stitches, and manage the care of her younger siblings with patience and creativity. Thomas often observed Margaret playing elaborate games with the twins and Emma that were actually disguised lessons in letters, numbers, and basic moral instruction. She had inherited her mother's teaching instincts and applied them with natural grace to the education of her younger siblings. The twins, James and Joseph, had begun to emerge from the shell-shocked quiet that had characterized their first few days at the farm. Their personalities, previously overshadowed by trauma and exhaustion, started to reveal themselves as distinct despite their identical appearance. More importantly, she'd begun to coax Thomas out of the emotional isolation that had defined his existence since Sarah's death. Her conversations revealed sharp intelligence, gentle humor, and a perspective on life that challenged his assumptions without ever seeming judgmental or intrusive. "You've been taking care of this entire farm by yourself for 8 months, she observed on Friday morning as they worked together in the vegetable garden, harvesting the last of the season's root vegetables. "That's an enormous amount of work. And for one person," Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "I managed well enough." Rebecca paused in her digging and looked at him directly. "Managing and thriving are two different things, Thomas. A farm this size should support a much larger operation than you've been maintaining." Her observation was accurate, but diplomatically stated. During the months following Sarah's death, Thomas had allowed several fields to lie fallow and had reduced his livestock holdings to the minimum necessary for basic subsistence. The farm could easily support twice as many cattle, a larger flock of chickens, and more extensive crop production. "I suppose I lost interest in expansion after Sarah died," he admitted. "It seemed pointless to build something I'd never share with anyone." Rebecca's expression softened with understanding. "And now?" Thomas considered the question seriously. Looking around the farmyard, he could see evidence of renewed life and energy everywhere. Daniel had repaired loose boards on the chicken coop without being asked. Margaret had organized the storage areas in the barn with impressive efficiency. Even the twins had contributed by gathering eggs with enthusiasm and care. "Now I'm beginning to think differently about a lot of things," he said. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats on the road leading to the farm. Thomas looked up to see a rider approaching at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual visitation. As the horseman drew closer, Thomas recognized him as young Billy Patterson, who worked as a clerk in the Millfield post office. "Mr. Crawford," Billy called out as he reined in his horse near the garden fence. "I've got news from town that you ought to hear right away." Thomas felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. In his experience, news that required immediate delivery was rarely the kind anyone wanted to receive. "What's happened, Billy?" The young man glanced uncertainly at Rebecca, clearly unsure whether the information he carried should be shared in front of her. Thomas noticed the hesitation and felt a flash of irritation. "Mrs. Morrison is part of my household," he said firmly. "Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of her." Billy nodded and continued. "Well, sir, there's been considerable talk in town this week about your situation here. Some folks are saying it's not proper. An unmarried man living with a woman and her children. Others are questioning whether the county auction was even legal, considering how much you paid." Thomas felt heat rise in his face. "And what business is it of anyone in town how I choose to live on my own property?" "That's just it, sir," Billy replied. "Some people are making it their business. Pastor Whitmore has been preaching sermons about moral standards and community responsibility. Mr. Hartwell, the man who was bidding against you at the auction, he's been telling anyone who'll listen that you took advantage of the situation for improper purposes." Rebecca had gone very still beside Thomas, her hands clenched around the handle of her digging tool. He could see tension radiating from her posture and realized that she had probably expected this kind of reaction from the beginning. "There's more," Billy continued reluctantly. "Sheriff Morrison, no relation to Mrs. Morrison here. He's been getting pressure to investigate the legal circumstances of the auction. Some people are claiming that the county didn't have proper authority to bind out a family that way, and they're suggesting that the whole arrangement should be declared invalid." Thomas felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The implications of Billy's news were staggering. If the county auction was declared invalid, the Morrison family could be forced to leave, potentially ending up in far worse circumstances than they had escaped. Or worse, if their living arrangement was deemed improper by legal authorities, Rebecca could face charges of moral turpitude that might result in her children being taken away entirely. "Who's leading this campaign?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Mostly it's Silas Hartwell and Pastor Whitmore," Billy confirmed. "But they've got support from some of the other prominent families in town. Mrs. Pemberton has been organizing the church ladies to petition the county supervisors. They're planning to present their concerns at next Monday's county meeting." Thomas looked at Rebecca and saw his own fears reflected in her expression. She had been through this kind of community persecution before, he realized. The carefully, controlled way she held herself, the quick assessment of potential threats in her eyes. These were the responses of someone who had learned to recognize danger before it fully materialized. "Thank you for the warning, Billy," Thomas said. "I appreciate you riding out here to let me know what's happening." After the young man left, Thomas and Rebecca stood in the garden in heavy silence. Around them, the evidence of their week's work. The orderly rows of harvested vegetables, the repaired fences, the general air of prosperity and contentment seemed suddenly fragile and threatened. "I should have expected this," Rebecca said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "People don't like arrangements that challenge their assumptions about how families should look or how social boundaries should be maintained." Thomas turned to face her fully. "Are you afraid?" Rebecca considered the question seriously before answering. "I'm afraid for my children," she said. "I've seen what happens when communities decide that a family doesn't meet their standards of respectability. The consequences usually fall hardest on the most vulnerable." Her words carried the weight of experience, and Thomas realized that the Morrison family's current situation was probably not their first encounter with social disapproval and its potentially devastating effects. "Then we need to be prepared," he said. "We need to understand exactly what legal challenges we might face and how to respond to them." Over the next 2 days, Thomas made several trips into Millfield to gather information and assess the extent of the opposition they faced. What he discovered was more troubling than he had anticipated. Pastor Whitmore had indeed been using his Sunday sermons to rail against what he termed moral irregularities that threatened the foundation of Christian family life. While he had been careful not to name Thomas and Rebecca directly, his meaning was clear enough that everyone in the congregation understood exactly which situation he was addressing. Silas Hartwell, meanwhile, had been more direct in his approach. He had visited several businesses in town, including the bank, the general store, and the grain elevator, suggesting that Thomas's judgment had become unreliable and that extending credit or conducting business with him might be unwise. Most concerning of all, Sheriff Morrison had confirmed that he was under pressure to investigate the circumstances of the county auction. While he had stopped short of suggesting that any laws had been broken, he made it clear that continued community pressure might force him to take official action. "Tom," the sheriff said during their private conversation in his office, "I've known you for 10 years, and I don't believe for a minute that you've done anything improper. But perception matters, especially when it comes to situations involving women and children. You need to be prepared for the possibility that this arrangement might not be legally sustainable." Thomas left the sheriff's office with a growing sense of urgency. The community's opposition was organized, vocal, and potentially powerful enough to disrupt the fragile stability that the Morrison family had just begun to establish. When he returned to the farm that evening, he found Rebecca waiting, and for him on the front porch. her expression serious but composed. The children were nowhere in sight, suggesting that she had deliberately arranged for privacy during their conversation. "I can see from your face that the news isn't good," she said as he climbed the porch steps. Thomas sat down in the wooden chair beside hers and explained everything he had learned during his visits to town. Rebecca listened without interruption, her hands folded calmly in her lap, though he noticed the slight tension in her shoulders that indicated she was absorbing every detail with careful attention. When he finished, she was quiet for several minutes, staring out across the fields where the last light of evening painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber. "Thomas," she said finally, "I want you to know that if this becomes too difficult or dangerous for you, my children and I will find another solution. We won't allow your reputation or your livelihood to be destroyed because of us." The offer was made with quiet dignity, but Thomas could hear the pain underlying her words. She was preparing to sacrifice the security and happiness her family had found here in order to protect him from the consequences of his own moral choice. "That's not going to happen," he said firmly. "We're going to fight this together." Rebecca turned to look at him directly, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and uncertainty. "And how do you propose we do that?" Thomas had been thinking about exactly that question during his ride home from town. The solution he had in mind was risky and would require careful timing, but it might be their only chance to secure the legal and social protection the Morrison family needed. "We're going to give the community exactly what they say they want," he said. "We're going to make this arrangement completely respectable according to their own standards." Rebecca's expression showed that she understood his meaning immediately, though whether she welcomed the implication remained unclear. "Marriage," she said quietly. "Marriage," Thomas confirmed. "A legal, religious ceremony that would make you my wife and your children my adopted family. It would eliminate every legal challenge to our arrangement and remove most of the moral objections as well." The proposal hung in the air between them, fraught with complexity and implications that neither of them had fully considered when they began this conversation. Around them, the evening sounds of the farm continued, chickens settling for the night, cattle lowing softly in the distance, the gentle creaking of the house settling against its foundation. Rebecca was quiet for so long that Thomas began to worry he had overstepped some crucial boundary. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of practical consideration and emotional uncertainty. "It would solve the immediate legal problems," she said slowly. "But marriage is supposed to be based on love, not legal convenience." What kind of foundation would that be for a family? Thomas had been wrestling with the same question. His proposal was logical, practical, and probably necessary for their mutual protection. But it was also a profound leap from their current arrangement as housemates to a legal and emotional partnership that would bind them together for life. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know that I care about you and your children more than I ever expected to care about anyone again. And I know that losing your family now would be devastating for all of us." In the gathering darkness, Rebecca reached across the space between their chairs and placed her hand over his. It was the first deliberately intimate gesture either of them had made, and it carried weight far beyond its simple physical expression. "Let me think about it," she said. "This decision affects not just us, but 5 children who have already experienced too much disruption and uncertainty." Thomas nodded, understanding that he had presented her with an impossible choice between potential disaster and an untested leap of faith. Whatever decision she made would shape the future of 7 people and determine whether their unconventional family could survive the storm that was gathering around them. As they sat together on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, both of them knew that time was running out. Monday's county meeting was only 3 days away, and whatever action they decided to take would need to happen quickly. The battle for their family's survival was about to begin in earnest. Rebecca Morrison spent Saturday night walking the boundaries of the Crawford farm, her shawl pulled tight against the October chill as she wrestled with the most consequential decision of her life. The moon hung full and bright above the Pennsylvania countryside, casting everything in silver light that made the familiar landscape seem dreamlike and strange. She had sent the children to bed hours earlier, after a supper marked by unusual quiet from the adults and puzzled glances from Daniel, who possessed an uncomfortable ability to sense undercurrents of tension. Now, with the house settled into nighttime stillness, Rebecca allowed herself the luxury of solitary contemplation. Thomas's proposal had shaken her more than she had let him see. Not because the idea was unwelcome. If she was honest with herself, she had begun to develop feelings for this gentle, principled man that went far beyond gratitude or practical appreciation. But because accepting his offer would mean crossing a threshold from which there could be no return, binding her fate and her children's futures to someone she had known for barely 2 weeks. The path she followed took her past the vegetable garden, where they had worked together that morning, before Billy Patterson's arrival had shattered their peaceful routine with news of community opposition. The orderly rows of harvested vegetables, carefully prepared for winter storage, represented hours of shared labor and quiet conversation. In those moments, working side by side with soil under their fingernails and the autumn sun warming their backs, Rebecca had felt something she hadn't experienced since her husband's death, the possibility of genuine partnership. But marriage was more than shared work and compatible temperaments. Marriage meant sharing a bed, sharing intimate thoughts and fears, sharing decisions about children and money, and the 1,000 daily compromises that defined family life. It meant trusting someone completely with her heart and her children's welfare, after 8 months of learning to depend solely on her own judgment and strength. As she walked, Rebecca found herself thinking about her first marriage to William Morrison. They had been childhood sweethearts in the small farming community where she had grown up, their engagement as natural and expected as the changing of seasons. Their 7 years together had been marked by deep affection, shared values, and the gradual accumulation of children and responsibilities that had defined their adult lives. William had been a good husband, faithful, hard-working, devoted to his family's welfare, but their relationship had grown from familiarity and community expectation rather than passionate choice. They had loved each other with the comfortable affection of people who had never known anything else, building their life together on the foundation of mutual respect and shared goals. What Thomas offered was something entirely different. Their potential marriage would be born from crisis and necessity, between two people who had been shaped by loss and forced to reconstruct their understanding of what family could mean. There would be no gradual courtship, no extended period of getting to know each other's habits and preferences. They would have to build intimacy and trust while managing a household of 7 people and defending their right to exist as a family. The challenge seemed overwhelming when she considered it in all its complexity. Yet as Rebecca continued her moonlit circuit of the farm, she found herself drawn repeatedly to a single, undeniable truth. In the 10 days since Thomas Crawford had stepped forward at the county auction, her children had begun to heal from traumas that had seemed insurmountable. Emma no longer woke screaming from nightmares about men coming to take her family away. The twins had regained the playful energy that had been suppressed by months of uncertainty and fear. Margaret was reading again, devouring books from Thomas's small library with the hungry enthusiasm of a naturally intelligent child who'd been denied intellectual stimulation for too long. Most remarkably, Daniel had begun to relax his vigilance. Protectiveness, allowing himself moments of genuine boyhood that Rebecca had feared were lost forever. Just yesterday, she had watched him racing around the farmyard with James and Joseph, their laughter echoing off the barn walls in a way that brought tears to her eyes. Thomas had done this, not through grand gestures or elaborate promises, but through steady kindness, practical help, and the simple act of treating her children as individuals worthy of respect and consideration. He had given them something more precious than shelter and food. He had given them the space to remember how to be children again. Could she really risk destroying that by clinging to romantic notions about love and marriage? Could she afford to prioritize her own emotional hesitations over her children's desperate need for security and stability? As if summoned by her thoughts, Rebecca heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She turned to see Thomas approaching, his own sleep, apparently disturbed by the weight of decisions that needed to be made. "I saw you from the bedroom window," he said as he drew near. "Couldn't sleep either." Rebecca shook her head. "Too much to think about." They walked together in companionable silence for several minutes, following the fence line that separated the pasture from the cornfield. The night air carried the scent of dying leaves and the distant sound of an owl calling from the oak grove near the creek. "Thomas," Rebecca said finally, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Of course. If we marry, what are your expectations? I mean, what kind of marriage are you envisioning?" The question hung between them, laden with implications about intimacy, romance, and the fundamental nature of their relationship. Rebecca could see Thomas struggling with how to respond honestly without presuming too much or promising too little. "I won't lie to you," he said slowly. "I hope that affection and genuine partnership would grow between us over time. I'm not proposing a marriage of pure convenience. I already care about you more deeply than I expected to care about anyone." Again, Rebecca felt her heart constrict at the quiet sincerity in his voice. "And if those feelings don't develop, if we find that we're simply not compatible in that way?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the care it deserved. "Then we would still be bound by our commitment to each other and to your children. I wouldn't abandon you or them because our marriage didn't unfold exactly as we hoped." It was exactly the answer Rebecca had hoped to hear, but it raised additional questions about the practical realities of sharing a life with someone who might remain essentially a stranger despite legal bonds. "I need you to understand something about my situation," she said. "When William died, I promised myself that I would never again allow my children's welfare to depend entirely on another person's goodwill. I've spent 8 months learning to be completely self-reliant, and the idea of surrendering that independence is terrifying." Thomas nodded slowly. "I understand. But Rebecca, you wouldn't be surrendering your independence. You'd be choosing to share it. There's a difference. Is there? If we marry, everything I own becomes legally yours. My children become your responsibility, to control as you see fit. Under the law, I would have no independent rights or authority. The harsh reality of 19th century marriage law hung between them like a barrier. Rebecca knew that choosing to marry Thomas would mean giving up every legal protection she had fought to maintain since William's death. She would become, in the eyes of the law, essentially his property, with no recourse if he proved to be other than the man he appeared to be. "I can't change the law," Thomas said quietly. "But I can give you my word that I would never use legal authority to override your judgment about your children or to prevent you from leaving if you chose to do so." Rebecca studied his face in the moonlight, searching for any hint of insincerity or manipulation. What she saw was genuine distress at the legal inequities she had described and a determination to find ways to mitigate them within their personal relationship. "Why?" she asked. Why are you willing to do this? You could find another solution. Send us away before Monday's meeting, perhaps, or help us relocate somewhere the scandal couldn't follow us. Why are you willing to tie your entire future to people you barely know? Thomas was quiet for so long that Rebecca began to wonder if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of carefully considered truth. Because Sarah wanted children more than anything else in the world, and watching her die without ever holding her own baby was the most painful experience of my life. When I saw you and your children on that auction platform, I saw a chance to honor her memory by protecting something she would have cherished. He paused, then continued more quietly. But that's not the only reason anymore. Over the past 2 weeks, your family has brought life back to this place in ways I didn't expect. Daniel's questions make me think more carefully about everything. I do. Margaret's laughter reminds me that joy is possible even after loss. The twins and Emma have filled this house with energy and purpose that I didn't realize I was missing. Rebecca felt tears prick at her eyes as Thomas continued. And you've shown me that it's possible to be strong and gentle at the same time, to face terrible circumstances with grace and dignity. I care about all of you now, not just as people I'm helping, but as family I want to protect and build a future with. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't a man making grand romantic gestures or empty promises. This was someone offering honest partnership based on genuine affection and shared commitment to her children's welfare. There's something else, Thomas added, something I need you to understand about the legal situation we're facing. Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. What do you mean? I spoke with Judge Harrison yesterday afternoon, quietly, unofficially. He confirmed what Sheriff Morrison told me. There's a real possibility that the county auction could be declared invalid, especially if the opposition can demonstrate that proper procedures weren't followed. The implications hit Rebecca like a physical blow. If the auction was invalidated, the Morrison family would have no legal protection at all. They could be separated, sent to different institutions, or bound out individually to anyone willing to pay the county's fees. But that's not the worst possibility, Thomas continued grimly. Judge Harrison also warned me that if our current living arrangement is deemed immoral or improper, you could face charges that might result in your children being declared legally abandoned. Rebecca's knees nearly buckled. The threat of losing her children was the nightmare that had haunted her since William's death, the fear that had driven every decision she had made for the past 8 months. "How much time do we have?" she whispered. "Mondays. County meeting is in 2 days. If we're going to marry, it needs to happen before then, tomorrow if possible. Judge Harrison has agreed to perform the ceremony quietly at his home, with minimal witnesses. The timeline was impossibly rushed, but Rebecca realized it might be their only chance to establish legal protection before their opponents could act. A marriage performed by a sitting judge would be virtually impossible to challenge, especially if it was accomplished before any formal complaints were filed. "I need to speak with my children," Rebecca said. "They have a right to understand what's happening and to have their voices heard before I make this decision." Thomas nodded immediately. "Of course, this affects them as much as it affects us." They walked back toward the farmhouse together, both lost in contemplation of the enormous step they were contemplating. The building looked peaceful and welcoming. In the moonlight, its windows glowing softly with reflected starlight. It was hard to believe that this sanctuary might be threatened by people who saw their unconventional family as a moral danger to the community. Inside, Rebecca found Daniel still awake, sitting by his bedroom window and clearly watching for their return. She wasn't surprised. Her eldest son had developed an uncanny ability to sense when adult conversations involved subjects that might affect his siblings' welfare. "Daniel," she called softly. "Could you please wake Margaret and bring her to the kitchen? I need to speak with both of you about something important." Within minutes, Daniel and Margaret sat at the kitchen table in their nightgowns, their faces serious with the premature gravity of children who had learned that adult conversations often brought significant changes to their lives. Rebecca had decided to speak with them first, reasoning that they were old enough to understand the complexities of the situation and help her explain things to the younger children in age-appropriate terms. "Children," Rebecca began, choosing her words carefully, "you know that some people in town disapprove of our living arrangement here with Mr. Crawford." Daniel's jaw tightened with anger that seemed far too adult for his 13 years. "They want to split us up again, don't they?" Rebecca felt her heart break a little at the fear and resignation in her son's voice. "They might try, but Mr. Crawford has proposed a solution that would protect our family legally." She explained Thomas's marriage proposal as straightforwardly as possible, emphasizing the practical benefits while acknowledging the emotional complexities involved. Both children listened with the focused attention of people who understood that their input might influence a life-changing decision. When Rebecca finished, Margaret was the first to speak. "Do you love him, Mama?" It was exactly the question Rebecca had been dreading, because it required her to admit uncertainties she wasn't sure she understood herself. "I care about him very much," she said carefully. "He's been kinder to our family than anyone had any right to expect. But love is complicated, especially for adults who have loved other people before." Daniel leaned forward in his chair. "But would he be good to us? Would he treat us like a real family instead of servants or charity cases?" Rebecca thought about the past 2 weeks, Thomas's patience with the twins' endless questions, his careful attention to Margaret's educational needs, his obvious respect for Daniel's growing maturity and capabilities. "Yes," she said with complete confidence. "He would treat us like real family." The conversation continued for another hour, with both children asking thoughtful questions about practical arrangements, future expectations, and the changes that marriage would bring to their household. Rebecca was struck by their maturity and their obvious concern for her welfare as well as their own. Finally, Daniel spoke for both of them. "Mama, we trust your judgment. If you think marrying Mr. Crawford is the best way to keep our family together, then we support your decision." Margaret nodded agreement. "Besides, I like him. He makes you smile in a way you haven't smiled since Papa died." The observation caught Rebecca off guard, but she realized it was true. Despite all the uncertainties and complications, Thomas Crawford had indeed restored something to her life that she had thought was gone forever. The possibility of genuine happiness and partnership. Early Sunday morning, Rebecca made her decision. She found Thomas in the barn, already at work with the morning milking, and simply said, "Yes." He looked up from the cow he was milking, his face transforming with relief and something that might have been joy. "Are you certain?" "As certain as anyone can be about something this important," Rebecca replied. "When do we need to be at Judge Harrison's house?" "This afternoon at 3 o'clock. I'll send word to him this morning." The wedding preparations were necessarily simple and rushed. Rebecca wore her best dress, a dark blue wool that she had sewn for special occasions during her marriage to William. Thomas borrowed a suit from his neighbor, who was approximately his size, and had been sworn to secrecy about the reason for the urgent request. The children were dressed in their cleanest clothes, their hair carefully combed and their faces scrubbed, until they shone. Despite the hasty circumstances, Rebecca was determined that this day should feel significant and ceremonial for them, a new beginning rather than simply a legal formality. Judge Harrison performed the ceremony in his parlor, with his wife and eldest daughter serving as witnesses. The service was brief but dignified, conducted with respect due to any couple choosing to bind their lives together. When Thomas slipped a simple gold band onto Rebecca's finger, Sarah's ring, offered with quiet ceremony the night before, Rebecca felt the weight of enormous change settling around her like a mantle. She was no longer Rebecca Morrison, struggling widow trying to hold her family together through sheer determination. She was Rebecca Crawford, wife and partner in an unconventional but legally protected family. As they drove home through the late afternoon sunlight, the children chattering excitedly in the back of the wagon about their new status as the Crawford family, Rebecca reached for Thomas's hand. Tomorrow would bring the county meeting and whatever challenges their opponents had planned. But tonight, they would face those challenges as a legally married couple with 5 children whose welfare was now protected by law. For the first time since William's death, Rebecca allowed herself to hope that the worst of their troubles might be behind them. Monday's county meeting had been a disaster from the moment Thomas and Rebecca walked into the Millfield courthouse hand in hand, their marriage certificate tucked safely in Thomas's vest pocket. The building buzzed with tension as townspeople filed into the main courtroom, their faces reflecting everything from curiosity to outright hostility. County Supervisor Harold Pemberton called the meeting to order with unusual formality, his gavel striking the wooden podium with sharp authority. Beside him sat his fellow supervisors, Marcus Webb and Jonathan Pierce, their expressions carefully neutral as they surveyed the packed courtroom. "We're here today," Pemberton announced, "to address concerns raised by several prominent citizens regarding recent events in our community. Mr. Silas Hartwell has requested the opportunity to present a formal complaint." Thomas felt Rebecca's hand tighten in his as Hartwell rose from his seat in the front row. The man had dressed for the occasion in his finest suit, his hair pomaded and his bearing radiating the confidence of someone certain of his moral superiority. "Honorable supervisors," Hartwell began, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed room, "I come before you today not as an individual seeking personal satisfaction, but as a concerned citizen protecting the moral foundations of our community." He paused dramatically, scanning the crowd before continuing. "2 weeks ago, we witnessed an unprecedented violation of public decency when Thomas Crawford purchased a woman and her illegitimate children at county auction, then proceeded to establish an immoral household that has scandalized every God-fearing family in Millfield County." Thomas started to rise in protest, but Rebecca's firm grip on his arm held him in place. Her eyes warned him to let Hartwell finish his presentation before responding, a strategy that proved wise as the man's accusations grew increasingly outrageous. "This arrangement," Hartwell continued, "was clearly established for purposes of sexual impropriety and exploitation." Crawford, a man overcome by base desires after his wife's death, saw an opportunity to acquire a woman and her children for his personal gratification under the guise of Christian charity. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Several women in the gallery fanned themselves with obvious distress, while their husbands nodded grimly at Hartwell's characterization of events. "Furthermore," Hartwell pressed on, "the hasty marriage ceremony performed yesterday afternoon was clearly designed to legitimize this immoral arrangement after the fact. It represents a mockery of the sacred institution of marriage and an insult to every decent family in our community." Pastor Whitmore rose from his seat to add his voice to the condemnation. "Brothers and sisters, I have witnessed the corruption that follows when moral standards are abandoned in favor of convenience and selfish desire. This situation threatens the very fabric of Christian civilization in our county." The pastor's words carried particular weight with many in the audience, his religious authority lending credibility to accusations that might otherwise seem excessive. Thomas watched several faces in the crowd harden with conviction, their initial curiosity transforming into active hostility. County Supervisor Webb leaned forward with obvious interest. "Mr. Hartwell, are you suggesting that the county auction itself was conducted improperly?" "I am indeed," Hartwell replied with satisfaction. "The Morrison family was bound out as a unit without proper investigation of alternative arrangements. No attempt was made to contact relatives who might have provided appropriate care. The entire proceeding was rushed and irregular." This accusation struck at the heart of Thomas and Rebecca's legal protection. If the auction was deemed invalid, their marriage would provide little defense against charges of moral impropriety or child endangerment. Supervisor Pierce shuffled through papers on the table before him. "I have the auction records here. Everything appears to have been conducted according to established procedures that were manipulated," Hartwell shot back, "to benefit a man whose judgment had clearly been compromised by grief and inappropriate desires." The attack was building momentum, and Thomas realized that their opponents had planned this assault carefully. Each accusation built upon the previous one, creating a narrative of corruption and impropriety that would be difficult to refute with simple denials. When Hartwell finally yielded the floor, Supervisor Pemberton looked directly at Thomas. "Mr. Crawford, you have the right to respond to these accusations." Thomas rose slowly, acutely aware that every person in the packed courtroom was studying his face for signs of guilt or deception. Beside him, Rebecca sat with perfect composure, her presence lending strength to his resolve. "Honorable supervisors," Thomas began, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart, "everything you've heard today represents deliberate distortion of events that were motivated by Christian charity and human decency." He pulled the marriage certificate from his vest and held it up for all to see. "Mrs. Rebecca Crawford and I were legally married yesterday afternoon by Judge Harrison. Our union was entered into freely by two adults who have developed genuine affection and respect for each other." Hartwell's voice interrupted from the audience. "After 2 weeks of immoral cohabitation." Thomas turned to face his accuser directly. "Mr. Hartwell, Mrs. Morrison and her children occupied separate bedrooms in my house, with proper chaperoning and complete respectability. Your accusations of impropriety exist only in your own corrupted imagination." The exchange sparked heated arguments throughout the courtroom as supporters of both sides voiced their opinions loudly. Supervisor Pemberton's gavel struck repeatedly as he called for order. "Furthermore," Thomas continued when quiet was restored, "I challenge anyone in this room to point to a single instance of actual misconduct or impropriety. You'll find none, because none occurred. What you will find is a family that was facing destitution, being offered sanctuary by someone who had the means to help." Pastor Whitmore rose again, his voice carrying the righteous authority of the pulpit. "Mr. Crawford, the appearance of impropriety is itself a violation of Christian standards. An unmarried man living with a woman and children creates scandal, regardless of what actually occurred behind closed doors." "Then you should be satisfied." Rebecca's voice cut through the discussion like a blade, "because we are no longer unmarried." Her decision to speak surprised everyone, including Thomas. Women rarely addressed public meetings, and Rebecca's intervention drew shocked stares from throughout the courtroom, but her words carried compelling logic. "Gentlemen, if the concern was propriety, then our marriage has addressed that concern. If the issue was the welfare of my children, then their adoption into a stable, loving household has resolved that as well. What exactly is the continuing problem?" Hartwell's face flushed with anger at being challenged by a woman, especially one he considered morally compromised. "The problem, madam, is that your hasty marriage cannot erase the scandal of your previous conduct." "What previous conduct?" Rebecca asked with devastating calm. "I was a widow trying to care for my children after my husband's tragic death. Mr. Crawford offered us shelter and protection when we had nowhere else to turn. He treated us with—" The question hung in the air, exposing the fundamental weakness in their opponent's position. No one could point to specific acts of impropriety because none had occurred. The entire case rested on assumptions and prejudices rather than evidence. Supervisor Webb seemed to recognize this problem. "Mr. Hartwell, do you have any witnesses to actual misconduct, any evidence beyond speculation and moral concern?" Hartwell's confidence wavered slightly. "The evidence is the situation itself. A respectable widower doesn't take in strange women and children unless his motives are improper." "According to whom?" Thomas demanded. "According to what law or moral principle? I'm not aware of any regulation that prohibits Christian charity or requires men to ignore families in distress." The debate continued for another hour, with various community members rising to voice their opinions on both sides of the issue. Thomas was surprised to discover that their situation had supporters as well as detractors. Several farmers spoke about the obvious improvements to his property and the well-behaved nature of the Morrison children. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartley, the widow who owned the boarding house near the railroad depot, provided particularly effective testimony. "I've seen those children in town several times over the past 2 weeks," she declared. "They're polite, well-dressed, and obviously well-cared. Whatever Mr. Crawford is doing, it's working to their benefit." But the most devastating moment came when Dr. Samuel Morrison, no relation to Rebecca despite the shared surname, rose to address the supervisors. As the county's most respected physician, his words carried enormous weight. "Gentlemen, I was called to examine William Morrison during his final illness. I can testify that he was a good man who loved his family deeply. His dying words were about his fear for what would happen to his wife and children after his death." The doctor paused, looking directly at Thomas and Rebecca. If William Morrison could see his family now, healthy, secure, and clearly thriving, I believe he would consider Thomas Crawford a godsend rather than a threat. This testimony seemed to shift the mood in the courtroom significantly. Several people who had been nodding along with Hartwell's accusations now looked uncertain about their position, but Supervisor Pierce wasn't finished. "The question remains whether the county auction was conducted properly. If there were irregularities, we may need to revisit the entire arrangement." This threat struck at the heart of Thomas and Rebecca's fears. Even if they could defend their marriage, an invalid auction might leave the children vulnerable to being removed from their care. "What irregularities?" Thomas demanded. "The auction was properly advertised, conducted by a licensed auctioneer, and witnessed by dozens of people. The Morrison family was offered as a unit, which is standard practice for families with minor children." County Clerk Albert Morse rose from his seat near the back of the room. "If I may address the supervisors, I have the complete auction records here. Every procedure was followed precisely according to county regulations." Hartwell wasn't ready to concede defeat. The amount paid was so excessive that it suggests ulterior motives. No one pays $50 for indentured labor unless they expect additional services. The accusation was crude enough to draw gasps from several women in the audience. Thomas felt his temper flare at the direct attack on Rebecca's character. "The amount I paid," Thomas said with deadly calm, "reflects the value I place on human dignity and family unity. If you consider $50 excessive for the welfare of 5 children and their mother, that says more about your values than mine." The meeting continued to deteriorate from there. Accusations flew back and forth while the crowd grew increasingly polarized. Several heated arguments broke out in the gallery, requiring intervention from the sheriff to maintain order. Finally, Supervisor Pemberton called for a recess so the supervisors could deliberate privately. Thomas and Rebecca stepped outside the courthouse to find themselves surrounded by a crowd of supporters and detractors, all eager to express their opinions about the proceedings. "Mr. Crawford," called out Mrs. Sarah Henderson from the general store, "my husband and I think you did exactly the right thing. That family needed help, and you provided it." But her voice was drowned out by angrier comments from Hartwell's supporters. "It's an abomination!" shouted someone Thomas didn't recognize. "Decent people won't stand for this kind of corruption." The crowd was growing uglier by the minute, with several men making threatening gestures while their wives voiced increasingly shrill condemnations. Thomas realized that regardless of the supervisor's decision, their family would face ongoing hostility from a significant portion of the community. When the supervisors returned, their faces revealed nothing about their conclusions. Pemberton resumed his seat and called for order before delivering their verdict. "After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence," he announced, "we find no grounds for invalidating the county auction. The Morrison family was properly bound out to Thomas Crawford according to established procedures." Thomas felt a surge of relief, but Pemberton wasn't finished. "However, we also find that the circumstances surrounding this arrangement have created significant community discord. We therefore recommend that Mr. Crawford consider relocating his household to a different county where these controversies might be avoided." The recommendation hit Thomas like a physical blow. The supervisors were essentially telling him to leave his home, his property, and his livelihood to satisfy his opponent's prejudices. "With respect, supervisors," Thomas said, rising to his feet, "I have no intention of abandoning my farm or my community because some people disapprove of my marriage." Hartwell's voice rang out from the audience. "Then you're condemning this county to ongoing moral corruption," Pastor Whitmore added. His support. "This decision will be seen as official approval of immoral conduct. What message does that send to our young people?" The meeting dissolved into chaos as supporters and opponents of the decision engaged in increasingly heated arguments. Sheriff Morrison was forced to intervene repeatedly to prevent physical altercations, and several families left in obvious disgust at the proceedings. As Thomas and Rebecca made their way through the hostile crowd toward their wagon, they could hear threats being made by various individuals who clearly weren't satisfied with the supervisor's limited action. "This isn't over, Crawford," Hartwell called after them. "Decent people won't let you corrupt our community without consequences." The ride home was conducted in tense silence, both Thomas and Rebecca understanding that they had won a legal victory that might prove Pyrrhic in its practical effects. The community remained deeply divided, and their opponents showed no signs of accepting defeat gracefully. That evening, as they prepared for bed in their separate rooms, an arrangement they had maintained despite their marriage to avoid any appearance of impropriety, Rebecca expressed the fears they both harbored. "Thomas, I'm worried that our victory today might have made things worse rather than better. Those men looked ready for violence when we left the courthouse." Thomas nodded grimly. "I've been thinking the same thing. Legal vindication doesn't change hearts and minds, and some of those people seem determined to find other ways to force us out." Through the bedroom walls, they could hear the children settling down for the night, their quiet conversations revealing their own anxieties about the day's events. Daniel had been particularly tense, his protective instincts heightened by the obvious hostility they had encountered. "Maybe we should consider the supervisor's recommendation," Rebecca said reluctantly. "If staying here means constant conflict and potential danger for the children, running away won't solve anything," Thomas replied. "These attitudes exist everywhere, and there's no guarantee we'd face less opposition somewhere else. At least here we have some supporters and legal protection." But even as he spoke the words, Thomas wondered if his determination to stand his ground was wise or simply stubborn pride. The hatred they had witnessed today ran deeper than he had anticipated, and he feared that their opponents might resort to extra-legal methods to achieve their goals. His fears proved prophetic. 3 days later, Thomas discovered that someone had poisoned his cattle during the night, killing 2 cows and sickening the third so severely that Dr. Morrison had to be called to try to save her. The message was unmistakable. If legal methods couldn't drive the Crawford family away, other approaches would be employed. Standing in the barn, looking at the dead animals that represented a significant portion of his livestock and income, Thomas realized that their real battle was just beginning. The county meeting had been merely a prelude to the sustained campaign of harassment and intimidation that would now follow. As he walked back to the house to tell Rebecca about the latest attack on their livelihood, Thomas saw her watching from the kitchen window, her face reflecting the same grim determination he felt building in his own chest. They would not be driven away. But the cost of staying was about to become much higher than either of them had anticipated. Rebecca's voice reached him, steady despite the circumstances. "Thomas Crawford, you are not going out there alone." He turned to see her standing in the kitchen doorway, her own rifle held with surprising confidence. The sight of his wife, he reminded himself with fierce satisfaction, prepared to fight beside him, filled Thomas with pride and terror in equal measure. "This isn't your fight, Rebecca." Her laugh held no humor whatsoever. "Those men out there want to destroy our family and possibly kill my children. How is this not my fight?" Through the window, Thomas could see the mob growing restless. Several men had dismounted and were examining the outbuildings with the calculating gaze of people planning an assault. Others were passing a bottle that it definitely wasn't water, their voices growing louder and more belligerent with each drink. "Crawford!" Hartwell bellowed again. "We know you're in there! You've got 5 minutes to send out that Morrison woman and her spawn, or we're coming in to get them." Thomas felt something cold and determined settle in his chest. He had faced Confederate cavalry charges during the war, stared down claim jumpers and cattle thieves, but nothing had ever felt as important as this moment. Everything he valued, his newfound family, his sense of honor, his very soul, hung in the balance. He moved to the front door and stepped onto the porch, his shotgun held at ready but not yet aimed at any specific target. The contrast between the warm light spilling from the house behind him and the angry torches before him seemed to symbolize the choice facing every person present. "Silas Hartwell," Thomas called out, his voice carrying clearly across the farmyard. "You're trespassing on my property with armed men. You have no legal authority here, and I'm ordering you to leave immediately." Hartwell's face twisted with contempt. "Legal authority? You think hiding behind marriage certificates gives you the right to corrupt this community with your perverted arrangements?" "I think the law is clear about a man's right to defend his property and his family," Thomas replied, "and I think you're about to discover that I take both responsibilities very seriously." Pastor Whitmore urged his horse forward a few steps, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of the pulpit. "Thomas Crawford, you have allowed sin to take root in your household. That woman was living here unmarried, exposing her children to moral corruption. Your hasty wedding doesn't erase the scandal of fornication and impropriety." The accusation hit Thomas like a physical blow, not because it carried any truth, but because of its calculated cruelty. These men were willing to destroy innocent children based on assumptions and prejudices that had no foundation in fact. "Pastor," Thomas said, fighting to keep his voice level, "you're standing in my farmyard with armed men, threatening a family that includes 5 children. I suggest you examine your own moral standing before presuming to judge mine." The mob stirred restlessly at this exchange, some voices calling for immediate action, while others seemed uncertain about the wisdom of their mission. Thomas realized that while Hartwell and Whitmore were committed to their course, several of the other men, might be having second thoughts about participating in what was essentially domestic terrorism. "We didn't come here to debate theology," Hartwell snapped. "We came to clean up a situation that's become an embarrassment to decent Christian folk. You can hand over that woman and her bastards willingly, or we can take them. Either way, they're leaving this farm tonight?" "Over my dead body," Thomas said quietly, but his words carried clearly in the still evening air. Behind him, he heard the front door open and close. Rebecca appeared at his side, her rifle held with professional competence, her face set with determination that matched his own. "And mine," she added. The sight of Rebecca standing beside her husband seemed to inflame the mob's anger rather than give them pause. Voices rose in outrage at her defiance, calling her names that made Thomas's finger tighten on his shotguns. "Triggers, you see," Hartwell shouted to his followers. "She's turned him against his own community. This is what happens when decent men allow themselves to be corrupted by immoral women." Thomas felt Rebecca stiffen beside him at the accusation, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "Mr. Hartwell, my children and I have done nothing but try to rebuild our lives after my husband's death. If our presence in this community threatens you so deeply, perhaps you should examine what that says about your own character." Judge Harrison spurred his horse forward, positioning himself between the mob and the farmhouse with dramatic authority. "In the name of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, I order this unlawful assembly to disperse immediately." But the judge's words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The crowd had moved beyond the reach of legal authority, driven by a combination of moral righteousness, alcohol, and mob psychology that made rational discourse impossible. Hartwell's voice rose. Above the general murmur, his face twisted with frustration at this official interference. "Judge, you can't protect corruption forever. This community has rights too." "The community has the right to due process and legal remedies," Harrison replied sharply. "What it doesn't have is the right to form armed mobs and terrorize law-abiding citizens." Thomas could see the situation deteriorating rapidly. Several men at the back of the group were clearly intoxicated, their voices growing louder and more belligerent with each passing moment. Others seemed to be losing patience with the extended negotiations, muttering about the need for decisive action. Sheriff Morrison dismounted and approached the porch, his hand resting meaningfully on his sidearm. "Tom, Rebecca, are you folks willing to come into town voluntarily while we sort this situation out? For your own safety?" The suggestion hit Thomas like a slap. Even the sheriff, supposedly their protector, was asking them to abandon their home and property to appease an illegal mob. "Sheriff," Thomas said carefully, "if we leave tonight, what guarantee do we have that there will be anything left to come back to?" Morrison's uncomfortable expression suggested that he understood the implication. Several mob members were eyeing the barn and outbuildings with obvious interest, and more than one voice had mentioned fire as a solution to their moral concerns. Rebecca stepped closer to Thomas, her rifle held with steady confidence. "We're not leaving our home, Sheriff. If these men want us gone, they'll have to remove us by force." Her declaration seemed to galvanize the crowd's anger. Several voices rose in outrage at her defiance, calling her everything from uppity to far worse epithets that made Thomas's blood boil. Pastor Whitmore's voice cut through the general chaos with practiced authority. "Brothers in Christ, we came here tonight to cleanse our community of moral corruption. Are we going to let corrupt officials and defiant sinners turn us away from our righteous purpose?" The pastor's words had an electric effect on his followers. Men who had seemed uncertain about their mission suddenly straightened with renewed purpose, their faces hardening with religious conviction. Judge Harrison clearly recognized the danger in Whitmore's rhetoric. "Pastor, I'm warning you, if anyone is hurt tonight, you'll bear legal responsibility for inciting violence." God's law supersedes man's law, Whitmore replied with frightening calm. Sometimes righteous action requires courage in the face of worldly opposition. Thomas felt ice in his veins as he recognized the pastor's words for what they were, a barely coded incitement to violence wrapped in religious justification. This was no longer a protest or even intimidation. This was a lynch mob preparing to act. "Rebecca," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the crowd, "when the shooting starts, you get those children to the root cellar and keep them there no matter what happens." Her hand found his arm, squeezing with fierce determination. "We stand together, Thomas. That's what we promised." The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. 23 armed men faced 2 people standing on a farmhouse porch, with only an elderly judge and a single sheriff as potential protection. The mathematics of the situation were stark and terrifying. Then everything went to hell at once. A young man near the back of the mob, Billy Patterson, Thomas realized with shock, the same clerk who had brought warning about community opposition, suddenly raised his rifle and fired a shot that splintered the porch railing inches from Rebecca's head. "Death to moral corruption!" he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. The gunshot released all the pent-up violence that had been building throughout the confrontation. Several mob members immediately opened fire while others charged forward, with weapons raised. The farmyard erupted into a battlefield as reasonable men transformed into killers driven by righteous fury. Thomas's first shot took down Billy Patterson, the heavy buckshot sending the young man spinning into the dirt with a scream of pain and surprise. His second barrel scattered 3 attackers who were rushing the porch steps, their charge dissolving into chaos and blood. Rebecca's rifle spoke with deadly precision, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. Her first target was a man trying to flank the house through the garden. Her second dropped someone who had been aiming at Thomas from behind a wagon. From inside the farmhouse, Daniel's rifle cracked repeatedly as the 13-year-old fired through windows at anyone threatening his family. The boy's marksmanship was impressive, and Thomas felt a surge of pride mixed with horror at seeing someone so young forced into such violence. Sheriff Morrison had drawn his weapon and was shouting for order, but his voice was lost in the chaos of gunfire and screaming. Judge Harrison's horse reared in terror, nearly throwing the elderly man as bullets whistled through the air around him. The mob's initial charge had been broken by the defenders' accurate fire, but Hartwell was already regrouping his followers. For another assault, the man showed unexpected tactical intelligence, directing some attackers toward the barn while others moved to surround the house. "They're trying to get behind us!" Rebecca called out, pointing toward shadows moving through the darkness beyond the farmyard's circle of torchlight. Thomas nodded grimly, reloading his shotgun with practiced speed. "Daniel!" he shouted toward the house. "Watch the back windows! Don't let anyone get close to the building!" The second assault came from multiple directions simultaneously. 6 men rushed the front porch while others approached from the sides and rear. The defending family found themselves surrounded by attackers who seemed determined to end the confrontation through overwhelming force. Thomas's shotgun boomed twice more, each blast sending attackers stumbling back with cries of pain and rage. But they kept coming, driven by a combination of mob mentality and religious fervor that made them willing to accept casualties in pursuit of their goal. Rebecca had shifted to a position where she could cover the house's left flank, her rifle, speaking with methodical precision as she targeted anyone who got too close to the building. Thomas could hear her calling out warnings and encouragement to the children inside, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. A man with a torch suddenly appeared at the side of the house, clearly intending to set the building ablaze. Thomas swung his shotgun toward this new threat, but before he could fire, Daniel's rifle cracked from an upstairs window. The would-be arsonist pitched forward, his torch falling harmlessly into the dirt. The battle seemed to reach a stalemate, with the attackers unable to advance in the face of accurate defensive fire. but the defenders running low on ammunition and unable to break the siege. Thomas realized they were facing a war of attrition they couldn't win. Eventually, their ammunition would run out, and the mob would overwhelm their position. Then salvation arrived from an unexpected direction. Hoofbeats thundered from the east as a group of riders approached at full gallop. Thomas's heart leaped as he recognized the lead figure, Dr. Samuel Morrison, the respected physician who had testified on their behalf at the county meeting. Behind the doctor rode at least 15 men, all armed and clearly intent on joining the battle. But which side would they support? Dr. Morrison's voice rang out across the farmyard as he surveyed the scene of violence and chaos. "Silas Hartwell, Pastor Whitmore, in the name of decency and law, I order you to cease this attack." Immediately, the new arrivals were respected members of the community, farmers, merchants, and professionals who had been appalled by the escalating violence. Their presence immediately changed the dynamics of the confrontation. Hartwell's face contorted with rage as he realized that his mob was now outnumbered by opponents. "Morrison, these men are defending moral corruption. You're choosing the wrong side." "I'm choosing the side of law and order," the doctor replied firmly. "This is attempted murder, not moral reformation." Several of Hartwell's followers began to edge toward their horses, clearly having second thoughts about continuing a battle they might not win. Others seemed prepared to fight regardless of the odds, their faces showing the fanatic determination of true believers. Pastor Whitmore raised his voice in a final attempt to rally his forces. "Brothers, we cannot let worldly intimidation turn us from God's work. The righteous must stand firm against corruption." But his words fell on increasingly deaf ears as more of his followers recognized the futility of continuing their assault. The arrival of community leaders supporting the Crawford family had broken the moral certainty that had driven the mob's initial attack. The battle dissolved into chaos as some attackers fled while others continued fighting with desperate fury. Gunfire echoed across the farmyard as the two sides engaged in running combat among the farm buildings and equipment. Thomas found himself face to face with Hartwell himself, the two men grappling for control of Thomas's shotgun in a desperate hand-to-hand struggle. The older man proved surprisingly strong, his fury lending him strength that nearly overcame Thomas's advantages in size and youth. "You've destroyed our community," Hartwell snarled as they wrestled. "This is all your fault." Thomas managed to break free and club his opponent with the shotgun stock, sending Hartwell stumbling backward into a wooden fence post. The man's face was bloody, but his eyes still burned with undiminished hatred. "No," Thomas replied, raising his weapon to cover the defeated mob leader. "This is what happens when good people refuse to stand up to evil." Around them, the battle was winding down as the surviving attackers either fled or surrendered to Dr. Morrison's volunteers. The farmyard was littered with wounded men and abandoned weapons, the torches that had provided dramatic lighting now scattered and dying in the dirt. Sheriff Morrison emerged from behind an overturned wagon, his uniform torn and his face grim as he surveyed the aftermath of the violence. Several of his deputies had arrived during the fighting, and they were now moving through the scene to arrest anyone who had participated in the illegal assault. Thomas looked around for Rebecca and felt his heart stop as he saw her lying motionless near the porch steps, blood staining her dress. He rushed to her side, fearing the worst, but was relieved to discover that she was conscious and alert, despite a bullet wound in her shoulder. "The children," she whispered as he knelt beside her. "Safe," Thomas assured her, though he could hear Emma crying from inside the house. Daniel kept them protected. Dr. Morrison appeared at Rebecca's side, his medical bag already open as he began examining her wound. The bullet went clean through, he announced with satisfaction. "Painful but not dangerous if we keep it clean." As the immediate crisis passed, Thomas began to fully comprehend what had just occurred. His peaceful farm had become a battlefield. His new family had been forced to fight for their lives, and several men lay dead or wounded in his farmyard. But they survived. More importantly, they had won, not just the battle, but the larger struggle for community acceptance. The arrival of Dr. Morrison and his supporters demonstrated that significant portions of Millfield County were appalled by the mob's actions and willing to defend the Crawford family's rights. Judge Harrison, disheveled but unharmed, made his way over to where Thomas knelt beside Rebecca. "This changes everything," he said with quiet satisfaction. "After tonight, no one can claim that you're the ones threatening community stability." Thomas nodded, understanding the judge's meaning. The mob's resort to violence had discredited their moral arguments and exposed them as dangerous fanatics, rather than concerned citizens. As dawn broke over the Crawford farm, revealing the full extent of the night's destruction, Thomas helped Rebecca to her feet and looked around at the scene of their victory. Buildings were damaged, livestock scattered, and the peaceful life they had been building lay in ruins. But they were alive, they were together, and they had proven that their love and determination were stronger than hate and prejudice. The real battle for their family's future was just beginning. 6 months later, the Crawford farm had become something extraordinary, a symbol of hope that drew visitors from across Pennsylvania and beyond. The farmhouse, rebuilt and expanded after the night of violence, now hummed with activity that extended far beyond a single family's daily routine. Rebecca stood in the kitchen, her arm fully healed from the bullet wound, directing preparations for the community school that had emerged from their dining room. 12 children from neighboring farms now gathered 3 days a week to receive education that their parents couldn't provide alone. Mrs. Crawford called 10-year-old Sarah Henley, whose father had been among Dr. Morrison's supporters, that terrible night. "Could you help me with this arithmetic problem?" Rebecca smiled at the title that still surprised her sometimes. The transformation from desperate widow to respected community leader had happened gradually, but the change felt complete now. She was no longer Rebecca Morrison, struggling to survive. She was Rebecca Crawford, teacher, wife, and cornerstone of a family that had become larger than blood relationships alone. Outside, Thomas worked alongside Daniel to construct additional barn space for the growing livestock operation that had replaced his modest subsistence farming. The boy had grown 3 inches and gained impressive muscle during their months together, his confidence blossoming under Thomas's patient guidance. "Pa," Daniel said. The word now came naturally, without the careful consideration it had required initially. "Mr. Henderson wants to buy 6 of our calves for his dairy expansion. Should we sell them or keep them for breeding stock?" Thomas paused in his hammering to consider the question seriously. Daniel's opinions on farm management had become increasingly valuable, and Thomas had learned to treat the teenager as a genuine partner rather than simply a student. "What do you think?" Thomas asked. "You've been tracking their growth rates and bloodlines more carefully than I have." The conversation represented a pattern that had developed throughout their household. Each family member had found roles that utilized their strengths while contributing to their collective prosperity. Margaret had become Rebecca's assistant in both teaching and household management, her natural intelligence flowering under encouragement and opportunity. The twins, James and Joseph, had discovered talents for mechanics and carpentry respectively, spending their afternoons learning trades from the skilled craftsmen who had become regular visitors to the Crawford farm. Emma, now 5 years old, served as the unofficial ambassador for their extended family, her natural charm winning over even the most skeptical visitors. The transformation extended beyond their immediate household to encompass the entire community. Pastor Whitmore had resigned his position after the night's violence, replaced by a younger minister whose sermons emphasized compassion over condemnation. Several families who had initially opposed the Crawford arrangement now sent their children to Rebecca's school and sought Thomas's advice on agricultural matters. Most remarkably, the county had quietly changed its policies regarding family auctions, establishing new procedures that prioritized keeping families together and ensuring proper investigation of alternatives before binding out arrangements were approved. Judge Harrison visited regularly, often bringing news of how their story had spread to other communities facing similar moral challenges. "You've started something bigger than you realize," he told Thomas during one such visit. Counties across the state are reconsidering their approaches to families in crisis. The legal vindication had been complete but almost anticlimactic. Silas Hartwell had been convicted of inciting violence and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Several of his followers faced lesser charges, though most had simply disappeared from the community rather than face the social consequences of their actions. But the deeper transformation was more subtle and profound. The Crawford farm had become a proving ground for the radical idea that families could be defined by love and commitment rather than traditional structures alone. Children from broken homes found sanctuary there. Widows discovered that independence and partnership weren't mutually exclusive. Men learned that strength could be measured by protection rather than domination. On warm evenings, Thomas and Rebecca would sit on their rebuilt porch, watching their children play in the fading light while discussing plans for expanding their educational programs and agricultural innovations. Their conversations had evolved from cautious politeness to genuine intellectual partnership built on shared experiences and mutual respect. "Do you ever regret it?" Rebecca asked one such evening, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "The auction, the marriage, all the complications we've faced." Thomas considered the question seriously, looking out over fields that had never been more productive, listening to children's laughter that had never been more joyful, feeling the contentment of a man who had found purpose beyond his own survival. "Never," he said simply. "Every choice we've made, every challenge we've faced, it brought us to this moment, to this family, to this life. I wouldn't change a single decision." As the stars emerged overhead, the sounds of their household settling into evening routines drifted from the house behind them. Danielle was helping the twins with their letters, while Margaret read a story to Emma. Inside, the rooms that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the comfortable chaos of a large, loving family. Their story had become legend throughout Millfield County and beyond. The tale of a desperate widower who bought a family at auction and discovered that love could be chosen as well as born, that courage could transform communities as well as individuals, and that sometimes the most radical act is simply treating other people with dignity and respect. The Crawford family had proven that true strength lies not in preserving tradition at all costs, but in having the wisdom to recognize when change serves justice and the courage to defend what matters most, regardless of the consequences. Their influence continued to ripple outward in unexpected ways. A month earlier, a delegation from the state capital had arrived to study their educational methods and family integration model. Rebecca's innovative approach to combining academic instruction with practical life skills had caught the attention of progressive educators throughout Pennsylvania. "Mrs. Crawford," the lead investigator had said, "your results with children from diverse backgrounds suggest possibilities we never considered. Would you be willing to train other teachers in your methods?" The invitation to address the state Education Board represented an opportunity neither Thomas nor Rebecca had ever imagined possible. A woman who had once faced auction as a vagrant would now influence educational policy for an entire state. But perhaps the most profound transformation had occurred within Thomas himself. The man who had spent 8 months in bitter isolation, convinced that life held no more possibilities for joy or purpose, now found each day filled with discovery and connection. His morning conversations with Daniel about crop rotation and livestock breeding had evolved into genuine mentorship. His evening discussions with Rebecca about philosophy, literature, and social reform had awakened intellectual curiosity he hadn't felt since his youth. "You know what strikes me most?" Dr. Morrison had observed during a recent visit. "Thomas Crawford was always a good man, but now he's become a great one. Sometimes it takes extraordinary circumstances to reveal what we're truly capable of." The doctor's words had resonated deeply with Thomas, who recognized the truth in them. The man who had impulsively bid $50 at a county auction bore little resemblance to the confident leader who now hosted weekly meetings of progressive farmers and social reformers. Their weekly gatherings had become legendary throughout the region. Every Saturday evening, the Crawford Parlor filled with neighbors, visitors, and correspondents who came to discuss everything from agricultural innovation to women's education to fair labor practices. Rebecca's insights on child development had influenced how several families approached parenting, while Thomas's experiments with crop rotation had improved yields across the county. Emma, now the acknowledged princess of these gatherings, would circulate among the adults with practiced charm, her innocent questions often providing the most penetrating observations of the evening. "Why do some people think children should be seen and not heard?" she had asked one particularly pompous visitor. "When children see things adults miss all the time." The question had sparked a 2-hour discussion about the value of youthful perspectives and the importance of listening to voices traditionally dismissed by society. As autumn returned to Pennsylvania, marking the anniversary of their first meeting, Thomas and Rebecca planned a celebration that would honor not just their personal journey, but the broader transformation their story had inspired. Families from across the state had requested permission to attend, wanting to meet the couple whose courage had changed how communities thought about love, family, and moral obligation. Standing together in their expanded kitchen, preparing for guests who would fill every room of their home, Thomas and Rebecca reflected on the miraculous year that had transformed their lives and touched countless others. "Do you think we'll ever fully understand what we started that day at the auction?" Rebecca asked, kneading dough for the bread that would feed their visitors. Thomas paused in his work, organizing chairs for the evening's gathering. "I think we started something that was meant to happen, maybe not through us specifically, but through someone willing to choose compassion over convention." Their story had become more than personal triumph. It had become proof that ordinary people faced with extraordinary moral choices could change the world simply by refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. The Crawford family had discovered that love multiplies when shared, that courage inspires courage in others, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply treating every human being as worthy of dignity, respect, and the chance to build a better life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.